In the summer of 1944, the war in Western Europe was moving faster than anyone had planned for. American and Allied forces had broken out of Normandy. German defensive lines were collapsing. General George Patton and his Third Army were cutting through France like a blade, moving so fast that supply officers could barely track where the front line was anymore. But something was about to stop the entire Allied advance. Not German tanks, not artillery, not even the weather. It was gasoline, ammunition, food, the simple, unglamorous reality that armies run on supplies, and the Allied supply chain was stretched to its absolute breaking point. German field marshals watching from the other side were almost amused. They had studied American military culture. They believed Americans were too soft, too dependent on comfort, too disorganized to build the kind of iron logistics machine that real warfare demanded. They were about to be proven catastrophically wrong. What would emerge in those desperate weeks was one of the most remarkable feats of military logistics in history. A round-the-clock trucking operation that kept 60,000 vehicles running, fueled an army across hundreds of miles of broken French roads, and helped determine the outcome of the war in Europe. It was called the Red Ball Express. To understand the Red Ball Express, you have to understand what happened at Normandy and why it created a logistical nightmare unlike anything the Allies had faced before. On June 6, 1944, Allied forces landed on the beaches of Normandy in northern France. It was the largest amphibious invasion in history. Within weeks, over 1 million soldiers were ashore, along with hundreds of thousands of vehicles and millions of tons of supplies. But for almost 2 months, the front barely moved. The fighting in the Norman hedgerows was brutal and grinding. Every field, every village became a battle. Allied planners had anticipated this. Their entire supply system was built around a slow, methodical advance. Then, on July 25, 1944, Operation Cobra changed everything. American forces punched through German lines near Saint-Lô. Patton's Third Army poured through the gap. Within days, the breakout turned into a full-scale pursuit. German forces were retreating faster than they could organize a defense. The Allies were suddenly advancing at a speed no one had planned for. The problem was the supply chain. Everything the armies needed, every drop of fuel, every artillery shell, every ration of food had to come from the beaches and ports in Normandy. The nearest major supply depots were nearly 500 kilometers from where the fighting was now happening. The railroad network across France had been systematically destroyed by Allied bombing before D-Day. It was brilliant strategy for the invasion, but it meant there were almost no functioning rail lines to move supplies forward. That left one option: trucks. Thousands and thousands of trucks driving day and night, hauling everything the Army needed across roads that were never designed for this kind of traffic. Allied logistics planners looked at what was needed and realized they were facing a crisis. They needed a solution immediately, and they needed it to work perfectly, because if the supply lines failed, the entire advance would stall. And stalling meant giving Germany time to recover and rebuild its defenses. The solution that emerged was bold, almost brutally simple, and completely unprecedented in scale. On August 25, 1944, the Red Ball Express officially began operations. The concept was straightforward. 2 one-way loops of road would be established across France. Loaded trucks would travel one route heading east toward the front. Empty trucks returning for more supplies would travel a separate route heading west. This prevented convoys from blocking each other and kept traffic moving in both directions around the clock. The routes were marked with red ball signs, hence the name. Every civilian vehicle was banned from these roads. Every intersection had military police directing traffic. The entire system was designed for one purpose only: maximum speed and maximum throughput. At its peak, the Red Ball Express operated nearly 6,000 trucks simultaneously. Drivers ran shifts of sometimes 20 hours or more. Many drove through the night with headlights blacked out or reduced to tiny slits to avoid attracting enemy aircraft. Navigation on unfamiliar French roads in the dark, exhausted, was a test of endurance few people today can fully imagine. The trucks themselves were primarily the 2.5-ton cargo truck known universally as the Deuce and a Half. It was a workhorse vehicle, rugged and reliable, but it was being pushed far beyond its design limits. Drivers learned to keep moving even when vehicles showed signs of mechanical stress. Stopping meant falling behind. Falling behind meant the front went without fuel. Maintenance crews worked around the clock to keep the fleet running. Tires were the single biggest problem. The constant load and the rough roads chewed through tires at a rate that overwhelmed supply officers. At one point, the Express was consuming tires faster than they could be shipped from the United States. Fuel consumption was another brutal irony. The trucks hauling fuel to the front were themselves burning enormous quantities of fuel to get there. Every kilometer traveled was a calculation of what was spent versus what would arrive. The Red Ball Express was not just a logistical system, it was a human story. And at the center of that story was a fact that military history often underemphasizes. The majority of the soldiers who drove the Red Ball Express were Black Americans. Approximately 75% of Red Ball drivers came from African American transportation and quartermaster units. These were men serving in a segregated army, in a country where they faced legal discrimination at home, fighting for freedoms that were systematically denied to them back in the United States. They drove through exhaustion, mechanical breakdown, enemy air attacks, and roads that could turn from passable to impassable overnight. They navigated by hand-drawn maps and roadside signs in a foreign country, in a foreign language, often in complete darkness. They did not receive the glory. Many did not receive the recognition. The combat units they supplied, the tank crews and infantry divisions, were largely white. The divisions that became famous for the Breakout were celebrated in newspapers and newsreels back home. The men who made it possible, the drivers of the Red Ball Express, were largely invisible in the public story of the war. But the generals knew. The logistics officers knew. Without those drivers, Patton's Third Army would have stopped dead somewhere east of Paris with empty fuel tanks and no ammunition. One figure who understood this deeply was General John C. H. Lee, the senior logistics commander for the European theater. He was controversial, sometimes difficult, but he grasped something fundamental. The Red Ball was not a support operation, it was a combat operation. The men driving those trucks were as essential to victory as the men pulling triggers at the front. The drivers themselves understood the stakes. Many spoke later about the sense of purpose they felt. They knew that if they kept moving, if they kept the convoys rolling, soldiers at the front would live, and the enemy would be pushed back. That knowledge drove them through shifts that would be considered inhumane by any modern labor standard. While the Red Ball Express built momentum, George Patton's Third Army was doing something that military historians still study with a kind of disbelief. Patton had always believed in speed as a weapon. He believed that a fast-moving army disrupted enemy thinking, prevented organized defense, and created psychological paralysis. He had proven this theory in North Africa and Sicily. Now in France, he had the open terrain and the opportunity to prove it on a massive scale. In August 1944, Third Army covered more ground in a single month than many World War I campaigns covered in years. Patton's armored columns swept east and south through France, bypassing German strongpoints, cutting supply lines, encircling entire German divisions before they could escape. At one point, Third Army was advancing so fast that Patton's headquarters was receiving radio messages from units that were well ahead of where maps said they should be. But all of this consumed fuel at a staggering rate. An armored division in full combat movement could burn hundreds of thousands of gallons of fuel per day. Multiplied across an entire army, across days and weeks of continuous advance, the numbers become almost impossible to comprehend. Everything depended on whether the Red Ball Express trucks could close that gap. There were moments when they almost could not. In early September 1944, Patton's tanks literally ran out of fuel and had to halt. Third Army, the fastest-moving force on the Western Front, stopped not because of German resistance, but because the trucks could not physically deliver enough gasoline fast enough. Patton was furious. He reportedly considered every option, including diverting fuel from other Allied armies. The logistical tensions between Patton's Third Army and Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's forces in the North became one of the most controversial debates of the entire campaign. Resources were finite, choices had consequences, and Patton believed with absolute conviction that his army, if properly fueled, could end the war before winter. German military leadership had underestimated American logistics from the very beginning. This was not entirely arrogance. It was partly based on observation. American industrial and logistical methods were different from European military traditions. German officers trained in a system that prized professional military culture, deep tactical knowledge, and the ability to fight resourcefully with limited supplies. American military culture, by contrast, seemed to German eyes almost commercial, focused on mass production, focused on overwhelming quantity rather than elegant quality. Several senior German officers wrote dismissively about American capabilities before the war and even in its early years. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, one of Germany's most experienced commanders, reportedly viewed American forces as impressive in equipment, but lacking in the kind of disciplined operational thinking that would allow them to sustain a rapid advance across a continent. What he and others failed to account for was exactly what the Red Ball Express represented. The American military had transformed industrial and commercial thinking into a weapon of war. The same organizational mindset that built the Ford assembly line, that created nationwide distribution networks, that managed railroad systems across a continent, had been applied to the problem of military supply. The Red Ball Express was not a military system in the traditional sense. It was closer to a massive commercial trucking operation run with military discipline and purpose. It was exactly the kind of thinking German strategists had dismissed. And it worked. By the time German commanders fully grasped the scale of what the Allies had accomplished logistically, the window for stopping the advance had already closed. The Red Ball Express had bought the Allied armies the time and momentum they needed to push deep into France and toward Germany's borders. The Red Ball Express achieved something extraordinary, but it also had limits, and those limits shaped how the war in Western Europe unfolded. The operation ran for 82 days, from August 25th to November 16th, 1944. During that time, it delivered approximately 412,000 tons of supplies to Allied forces across France. But the system consumed itself in the process. Trucks broke down faster than they could be replaced. Drivers reached a point of exhaustion that affected their judgment and their safety. Accidents on the routes became a constant problem. Vehicles running without proper maintenance failed at critical moments. There was also a deeper issue. The Red Ball Express was a temporary fix for a permanent problem. The Allies needed functioning ports and rail lines to sustain a long-term advance into Germany. The port of Cherbourg had been captured early, but German forces had demolished it so thoroughly that it took months to restore full operations. The port of Antwerp in Belgium was captured in September 1944. But the approaches to it through the Scheldt estuary were still held by German forces. Until Antwerp was fully operational, the Allies were still running on improvisation. The fuel crisis of early September 1944 is often cited as one reason the Allies failed to end the war before the end of 1944. If supply lines had been able to sustain multiple simultaneous advances, the opportunities that briefly opened in the autumn of that year might have been exploited fully. That debate continues among military historians. What is clear is that the Red Ball Express extended the Allied advance as far as it could go under the circumstances. It was a remarkable achievement, and it was not enough by itself to close the war. When the Red Ball Express officially ended operations in November 1944, the strategic situation in Western Europe had been transformed. The Allies were now fighting along Germany's borders. The rapid advance across France that the Red Ball Express had sustained, however imperfectly, had brought the war to a point that seemed almost unimaginable just a few months earlier. The German military never recovered its position in France. The speed and scale of the Allied advance had destroyed entire German formations, captured territory that represented years of Nazi occupation, and liberated millions of people. For the men who drove the Red Ball Express, the end of the operation did not mean the end of the war. Many were reassigned to other logistics duties as the more conventional supply systems of ports and rail lines came online. Some were transferred to combat support roles. The work continued, less visible, less dramatic, but just as essential. The recognition those men deserved was slow to come. For decades after the war, the story of the Red Ball Express was a footnote in broader histories of the Normandy campaign and the liberation of France. The combat commanders received the monuments and the memorials. The logistics soldiers and the black Americans who drove the majority of those trucks received far less. In recent years, historians and documentarians have worked to correct that record. The Red Ball Express is now recognized as one of the defining logistical achievements of the entire Second World War. And the men who built it, who drove through the dark, who kept those engines running on willpower and determination, are finally receiving a portion of the recognition they always deserved. There is a version of history that focuses only on the men who fired the guns. It is a natural instinct. Combat is visible. Combat is dramatic. Combat produces the moments that photographs capture and that memory preserves. But war is sustained by something less visible. By the men who drove through the night on roads they had never seen before, carrying fuel for tanks they would never ride in, delivering ammunition for battles they would never fight in. By the planners who looked at a map of shattered roads and a fleet of battered trucks and asked not whether it could be done, but how to do it faster. The Red Ball Express was not a glorious operation. It was an exhausting, dangerous, relentless grind. It chewed up vehicles and chewed up men. It ran on improvisation and determination and the refusal to accept that the thing could not be done. German generals had looked at American military culture and seen softness. They saw a country that valued comfort over discipline, quantity over quality, commerce over craft. What they missed was that America had learned to turn the machinery of commerce into a weapon. That the same thinking that built transcontinental railroads and mass-produced automobiles could be pointed at the problem of supplying an army moving at speed across a continent. And when it was, the result was 412,000 tons of supplies delivered across France in 82 days. The result was Patton's Third Army staying in the fight when it should have run dry. The result was a German defensive line that never stabilized, never recovered, and never held. The men who drove the Red Ball Express did not end the war by themselves. No single operation does. But they kept it moving at the moment when it might have stopped. And in war, momentum is everything. Remember their names. Remember their roads. Remember that the most important work is not always the most visible.